Good evening, everyone. My name is Daphna Rabinovich, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the Giller Book Club, the last one in our series of 14. I can't even believe that we're at the end of the 2020 long list. Please make sure to have your Zoom on a side-by-side view for the best possible experience. And it is my profound pleasure to introduce you to our interviewer tonight, author, speaker, activist, and icon, Jael Richardson. Jael is the author of The Stone Thrower, A Daughter's Lesson, A Father's Life, a memoir based on her relationship with her father, CFL quarterback Chuck Ely. The Stone Thrower was adapted into a children's book in 2016 and was also shortlisted for a Canadian Picture Book Award. Jael is a book columnist and guest host on CBC's Q. She holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of Guelph and lives in Brampton, Ontario, where she founded and still serves as the executive director for the Festival of Literary Diversity, also known as FOLD. Her debut novel, Gutter Child, is a dystopian story of courage and resilience and was published in January 2021 by HarperCollins Canada. Tonight, Jael will be interviewing Emma Donoghue, author of the novel The Pull of the Stars, longlisted for the 2020 Scotiabank Giller Prize. There'll be lots of fascinating questions, and if you'd like to join in on the conversation, please feel free to submit a question using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, please welcome Jael and Emma.
Hello, Giller family. Hello, Emma. So excited to be here. You heard a little bit of introduction about Emma, but I'm going to give a few more teasers. I mean, most of you came here for Emma. You know Emma Donoghue. She's born in Dublin. She's there right now in Ireland. She's the author of the books Room, The Wonder, many more. I went to the list and I was like, how does one person write so many things? Oh my gosh.
I'm old, that's
and
why.
So well. She's won numerous awards, including the Rogers Trust Prize for Fiction, also the Commonwealth Prize for Writers. She's been a finalist for the Man Booker Prize. She was on the long list for the Giller Prize last year. We're going to talk about her book, The Pull of the Stars, today. Emma, welcome.
Thank you.
Well, to place people, tell folks where you are and why and what time it is.
I did have a very exciting day. It's now midnight, but I'm still wired because I got to be an extra on the film set of the film that they're making of my 2016 novel, The Wonder. So, you know, it always seems so unlikely that a film makes it all the way through the adaptation process and you actually get the money and make the movie. This has happened to me twice now. Can't believe it. My first one, Room, was made in and around Toronto. This one is being made in deep in the countryside in Ireland. So I got to be dressed up and be an extra. It was the most fascinating day. Not the typical writer's day, as you know, most of we stay home in our pajamas.
You don't do that all the time, Emma, just dress up and wander the countryside?
When we're allowed, when those of us who aren't broadcasters are allowed out of our house and meet people, you know, and you're meeting them in the context of a movie of your book, it's just so overexciting.
I love it. I'm jealous because, I mean, I studied theater, I studied acting. When I came out of university, I initially did extra work and commercials. And I'm like,
you know all about it then.
Maybe one day I will live the Emma Donoghue life and I will be able to be on the set of my own book's movie. Like that.
I hope you're adapting Gutter Child as we speak, you know. The authors should always do it themselves, I say.
Thank you. Thank you for that shout out. I want to begin. We're going to hear a reading in a second, in a little bit, but I wanted to ask a question first because you're writing this novel, The Pull of the Stars, and I'm curious about where your starting point is, like how you arrive at the ideas for your novels. That's when I opened up that list and I saw all the books that you've written, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm curious about where they begin, where the idea begins, and whether it's changed over time for you in terms of how you decide what book you're going to work on next.
Good question. It hasn't changed over time. It's more that it goes between things in my life or the lives of my friends or loved ones, you know, kind of proximate causes, you might say, And then things from far away in history that I come across often a real incident and get completely obsessed, and I just go down that rabbit hole like we all do on the internet, but in my case I have to stay down the rabbit hole till I've written a novel. So in the case of The Pull of the Stars, it wasn't really one particular little known incident. It was the Great Flu. And you might say, you know, we know about the Great Flu, but it was always kind of overshadowed by World War I. It's never really got enough attention, considering there was this massive pandemic that, you know, seems to have killed about 4% of the human race. You know, really puts COVID in context just in terms of sheer numbers. So I think if it had happened in 1930, it would be like the big thing of that decade. But because it was in 1918, it was just seen as like one of the awful kind of, you know, final throes of World War I. So what started me in this case, you know, so often novelists owe a huge amount to journalists. So I was stuck on a train from London, Ontario, where I live, to Toronto, and I'd left my computer at home by accident, charging. I had nothing to read. So I had a copy of The Economist, which I usually think of as quite a dry magazine. So I read it cover to cover. And there was a long, well-written article about the flu of 1918. And I found myself thinking, what a weirdly modern plague that was. This wasn't like medieval times with bunches of herbs in your pointy mask. You know, this was people getting on the tram and going to work, and suddenly everything was shut. So I thought, how interesting to write a kind of plague novel, but set in a modern world. It would feel quite dystopian. So I thought, okay, it's not actually dystopia, you know, future genre, but it would have that weird vibe, you know, like how do you carry on with your work when everything about you is falling apart? And I thought, okay, I have to choose someone with really important work. So I decided to go for a nurse and a nurse midwife, because one of the facts I found really early on was that women in late pregnancy or just after birth were the most likely to be hit hard by this terrible flu and to have awful side effects and disrupted births. And I thought, that's really interesting to have two different medical dramas going on. You know, I'm a lifelong fan of Grey's Anatomy, and it's definitely had an influence here. So I thought, where did they put these women who were in labor and had the flu? They had to quarantine them in some way. So I imagined a tiny little ward for women going through both those crises at the same time. And I thought, I'm obviously going to be critical of the society I'm writing about, because pandemics don't show a society at its best, to say the least. So I'll set it in my home country of Ireland. And I thought it would have interest to people as a kind of story that could happen anytime, but did happen in 1918. And then I completely finished the novel, sold it, delivered the last draft, and then COVID happened. So I did not mean any contemporary relevance, but of course, pandemics bring out the same appalling human behaviors in every era, I think. So in fact, it's turned out to be, you know, full of echoes of COVID, but none of them were intentional. It's just, you know, in any era, pandemics hit hardest those who we have already agreed to put in bad housing, crowded housing, you know, bad air, bad water, bad food, you know, and then we blame people for getting whatever the illness of the day is. So yes, it's been a year and a half of weird kind of echoes for me, having written a pandemic novel pre-COVID.
Well, I'm going to ask you about some of that afterwards, but I want to, before I do that, get you to read a little bit. And I have to say, I listened to this as an audiobook, and I bought the book. I'm one of those people that buys both. And
wow.
I bought the book.
Let's do that. What a good habit to adopt.
Authors love me, but I'm like, my bank account does not. Because when I opened it, as soon as I opened the book and saw that it was set in Ireland, I'm like, I wonder if the audiobook reader is Irish, and I want to like hear it. And so that's why I ended up listening to the audiobook. So I thought it would be great to have you read. For those that read it in the text, to actually hear your voice reading the text, I think will be really special.
You know, the audiobook reader was Irish because I insisted, because basically the publisher said to me, oh, it's the middle of COVID. Can we just use an American with a brogue? And I was like, you will not. So I like emailed everyone I knew in theatre in Ireland. And I was like, I need an actress who can get access to a recording facility in April 2020. And yeah, we found the wonderful Emma Lowe. So, okay, I'm going to read a little bit. Julia Power is the nurse midwife. Bridie Sweeney is an entirely untrained volunteer who's been helping her in this ward in these desperate times. And they've had an incredibly grueling 2 days. So they're now up on the roof of the hospital, just having a little respite. I think that's all you need to know. Face tipped up to the sky, Bridie swayed. I took her elbow. Don't topple over the edge now, I warned. The stars are so bright, I'm dazzled, she said. I looked up and found the Great Bear. I told her, in Italy, they used to blame the influence of the constellations for making them sick. That's where influenza comes from. Bridie took that notion in stride. As if, she said, when it's your time, your star gives you a yank. And she tugged as if reeling in a fish. It's hardly scientific thinking, I admitted. Bridie said, maybe not, but I have heard it's all set down up there. What is set down? I asked. The day each of us is going to die. Oh, that's pure nonsense, Bridie. She lifted, then dropped her bony shoulders. I don't have to be scientific, she said. I'm not the nurse. You've the makings of one, though, if you wanted, I said. Bridie stared and then laughed that off. I did realize that this job was too grim for most people, all the stinking and leaking and dying. Mine was a peculiar vocation. You know, Bridie, I said, I mark down every patient I lose. Where? She said, in a book. I think you saw me doing it, I said. I pulled out my watch now without looking at the time, and I had dropped it in her palm, face down. Bridie weighed it in her hand. Would this be solid silver? I suppose so, I said. It was my mother's. I added that so she wouldn't think I had earned enough to buy myself such a thing. She said, it's still warm from you. The chain between the two of us was a taut umbilicus. I put my finger to one of the bockety scratched circles on the watch back. I said, every full moon means a patient of mine who's died. But not through your fault. Well, I hope not, Bridie. It's hard to be absolutely sure. You know, in this job, one has to learn to live with that. She asked, and the little curved pieces? Well, they're crescent moons instead of full ones. The babies, she said. She never missed a trick, this one. I nodded. They're the babies. Bridie peered more closely now at the watchback. Some of them were only little scratches, she pointed out. Those ones were stillborn, I said, or miscarried if far enough on that I could tell whether it was a girl or a boy. So, Julia, you scar your precious watch for all of them because you feel bad. I shook my head. Bridie suggested, you want to remember them? Oh, I remember them anyway, I said. Often I wish I didn't remember them. Do they haunt you, like? I struggled to find the words. I said, I have a sense they want to be recorded somewhere. They need to be. They demand to be recorded, even. Bridie stroked the silver curve and she said, it's a sort of map of the dead then, a sky full of moons. I'll leave that there, thank you.
I love hearing the two of them talk, and we get really interesting perspectives from the two of them. And I want to get to that, but I want to ask another question about the sort of setting, the historical fiction nature. I know The Wonder also was set in historic Ireland, if I'm correct. And so what is it about that time frame, that looking back, looking into the past, and specifically in the place where you were born, that interested you?
It's funny, I often seem to manage to get more worked up about, you know, something bad in the past, like the fact, you know, a baby born in Dublin in 1918 was less likely to survive that year than the soldiers in the trenches in Belgium and France. You know, I'll get all agitated about that. And then I sometimes think, oh my God, look at the paper. There's plenty going on you could get agitated about right now. And I think it's that the news, it just seems to weigh on you so directly. It's so painful to have something happening and to feel you can't do enough about it. So unless you have a life that's really fully committed to activism, there can often be a sense of helplessness. A lot of us have felt helpless this year reading the headlines, or just got, you know, irrationally angry charting some policy failure on Twitter. So, you know, I often find those pains, those horrors easier to deal with at the kind of long distance of history. And of course, the same stuff that can come up, you can make the same kind of, you know, arguments and analyses, but in another era, so you kind of set them in a different frame. One thing I love about writing historical fiction is that people's mindsets were rather different back then. I mean, they were just like us, of course, except for the moments when they weren't. And I love bringing the reader together with my character from the past, like all chummy 1 minute, and you're thinking, oh, we're all the same throughout history, we're all the same. And then you give them some little flash of a 1918 attitude rather than a 2021 attitude. And the reader is a bit like kind of, whoa, and you have to be careful of those moments because your character can lose sympathy. Like there's a moment when one of the women in the ward has a stillbirth, and Julia does what was just policy at the time. She puts it in a shoebox. She puts it on a shelf, and she sort of changes the subject. And I was thinking, okay, my modern readers are going to be appalled, but I don't want to make Julia anachronistic by having her be all like, oh, do you want to be with your baby? Talk about your feelings, Yeah. So I tried to kind of find a meeting point there. I have her put the stillborn child in the shoebox, but I give her a moment of thinking like, oh, maybe I should perhaps have asked the mother to hold her, So I gave her a qualm, I guess. But I love those moments when you're, you're asking questions like how different were people then and how much were they the same? Just as frankly, if you're reading a novel today about someone who's really not you, you've got moments of thinking like, yes, I'm just like them. And then other moments of, whoa, who are you? I mean, that's all part of the amazing kind of machine for empathy that a novel is. It brings you into the head of people who are not you, which could sometimes be an uncomfortable place.
I love that. And it's such a key to get people to see a character, to sort of go along with them and then be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I wouldn't do that, Bridie. I wouldn't have, all these sorts of things. So I think it's a real gift to be able to find those moments and do that. I love what you said about history, because I feel like the opposite in a lot of ways. Like I can't go into history. It's like too hard to wade in there. But it's also too hard to wade in the present, which, it's a conundrum.
I think the future I find way harder. Some writers are so comfortable there. I did one short story this year set in a near future, and I just changed one little thing about our society. I made it like nobody's having babies anymore, like nobody. I kept everything pretty much the same, and I only went forward 40 years, and I found that such a cumbersome work of world building. I was like, but no, that'll change that, and everything was contingent and everything else, and I was like, how do sci-fi authors do it?
It's true. Future is like
some records, at least I can.
It's true. There's so many things to think about. And I think, history is a place where you can gather a lot of information and sort of hold to facts. Like certain facts are inarguably
atmosphere. True. I mean, I had so many atmospheric sources to draw on. I had like nurses' diaries, letters from volunteers talking about like how exciting all these highly capable women who were like for the first time ever finding themselves really given meaningful work. And even if they weren't getting paid and they were surrounded by dying people, and even if they caught the flu, they were just so excited to be part of it all.
And do you love that research part? Like, is that something you get like too deep into it that you can't even get yourself out?
I sort of let myself go as deep as I want because I enjoy it so much. And I know that I'm not going to use it all, but in a way you can't know what you're going to use until you find it. Or even you can't even know how you're going to use it. Here's a tiny example actually from the set of the movie today. The Wonder, we were filming a scene where like somebody, tells a tragic story about the family of the journalist Will Byrne. In the book, that's just a story about somebody else that's told. And I know I got it from doing kind of in-depth research into the famine in Ireland, just as kind of backstory for my novel, just, background. But I found this little tragic story and it made its way into the book. And now it's making its way to the forefront of the script. And it's kind of key explanation of a character. And if I tried to skimp on collecting the little details, I wouldn't have found that one. So yeah, it's like wandering through a mine looking for there's tiny little flashes of gold.
I'm going to bring in a question that just came in. You can ask questions and we'll have time for that at the end, but because it's relevant, I want to bring it in. It was about the clothing as well. Was that something that you had to be were you pulling out outfits and sort of pinning up what was there and thinking about that? Like the question was about when Julia's riding the bike and she pulls the strings and the tape, like how particular did you get when you were doing this research?
I didn't have 1918 clothing, but yeah, I would have looked at costume books and files, and I would have asked myself questions like, I knew that the book would be set mostly in this intense little ward because, you hardly need to point it out. I clearly have a thing for confined spaces. And as a literary setup, I like to limit my characters' options. But I thought, okay, we're at least going to have the journey to work each day and the journey home. How will she get there? I thought I want her to be modern and energetic and fit, so she'll cycle. But then I thought, oh, she's going to sweat, isn't she? You know, and I just couldn't, you know, nurses had to be so proper and correct. You know, I looked a lot at the details of nursing training, and, you know, maybe 3 of the courses would be what we recognize as actual medical training. And then others were like decorum, you know, being careful not to speak about patients' health in front of the patients, never tell the patient your first name. There was a huge amount about neatness and properness and manners and reserve and basically being ladylike and prissy. So I thought, okay, the matron's going to give her hell if she turns up all sweaty. So I decided Julia would have to, you know, like get off halfway and get on the tram. And then, yeah, I thought about like, oh, if she's cycling, what's she wearing? So yeah, it is a bit like planning how to act a character, I guess. You have to get quite precise. And I loved the idea that there were these clothes that they would kind of covertly turn into, you know, like athleisure practically by winching up the skirt with little internal strings. It seemed very clever to me to kind of, you know, have your cake and eat it in terms of, I'm going to cycle and then I look like a lady, you know.
I totally would have been that girl. I would have been like, I feel like I try and pull that off now. You made a really interesting comment that I was going to ask about the maternity ward and why that space, but I want to get at what you were saying about your interest in confined spaces, because that really fascinates me. It's a particular constraint in writing to make so much of the action happen in one room. And some people might find that freeing. Some people might find that challenging. What is it about? What does that do for you as a writer?
It's totally freeing for me because what I really love is dialogue, right? So I like writing plays and novels and film scripts and radio plays because they're all just people yapping. And I yap a lot myself. And I'm from a big family. There were 8 kids. There were 10 of us at the table, yap, yap, yap all the time. So that's the water I swim in, right? So if you want dialogue, not just to be part of your book, but to be absolutely crucial, you know, you trap people in an elevator, or you make them all stay in a small maternity ward, or occasionally you make them grow up in a locked room, because then not only do they have to talk a lot because they're not doing much else, but their talk is formative. You know, like the Ma Jack conversations in room, they totally shape him and they totally console her. They let her feel that her life is meaningful rather than being just imprisonment. And, you know, with Bridie and Julia, I wanted conversations which would like really quickly and intensely change them both. I was kind of, the reason the novel takes 3 days is I was wondering like how long it would take someone to catch the flu, how long it would take someone to change their life, how long it might take someone to fall in love. You know, could you do all this in just a couple of long shifts, you know? And so when you bring strangers together and have just a couple of days of them talking, I love the way you really quickly not just build up a rapport, but people start to go like, oh yeah, you told me your mother was dead. You know, they remember what the other one has said. They start to have little in-jokes and echo each other almost immediately, and conversation becomes this amazing kind of dance. So basically, I love how the confined space intensifies things. It seems to turn up the emotional temperature and create really rapid bonding and rapid antagonism as well. Like say there's an orderly called Groin. I did saddle him with a very ugly name there. And, you know, he's not in the ward all the time, but he regularly turns up, he brings patients in, he takes dead ones away, and he annoys Julia every time. So yeah, I just like what those limitations do. Whereas if you tell me I can set a novel in the entire history of the world, I'd be a bit like, whoa, which continents, when, you know? And it's not just that it would take a lot of research, but it's hard to choose which scenes you show when. I don't tend to do big epic family dramas lasting 70 years. It's kind of agony to chart your course through all that. Whereas if you give me a week and a couple of people and ideally a fairly limited space, I think it sort of gives everything the virtues of a play, because plays have very traditionally had those unities of time, space, and action. I mean, they don't have to, of course, a play can roam, but very often it's just a few people on a bare stage saying, listen to me.
I love that. I don't get to talk to very many writers who are also like theater enthusiasts and dialogue enthusiasts. So this is my jam. I'm excited.
Oh, it's the best. They should all have to write a play, you know, a really low budget play, like $50 and a small carpet to stand on and see what you can come up with.
Right? Because a dialogue for me is so key. It's so key. When you get it right, it makes magic. When you don't, you're like, oh, what is happening? I want to talk about the women in the story, because one of the things I read an article about the book, and they were talking about how typically wartime stories are all about the men at battle, the soldiers at war, the women pining while they're away, kind of thing. And to set this novel in 1918, but then to put it in the maternity ward, it forces the story to be about the women, about what the women are going through, nurses, and just a few men sort of sneaking in and out in difficult ways. What is it about the characters you chose, the women you chose, that you wanted to explore that in this work, particularly when it comes to feminism, but also just like women interacting with women?
Well, one thing I wanted to do was, to set a novel in a maternity ward, it might seem to be really focusing on reproduction as the thing women do. And I would hate anyone to think that that's what I was doing, like this novel is the essence of femininity. No, I don't think that way at all. And so the women helping the mothers give birth, these are all women who are not having babies. They're almost like a kind of spinster, almost priestess class of like nurses and helpers and doctors and midwives, and they're not having babies themselves, and they're they really loom even larger than the women giving birth. So it's several different aspects of women's lives back then. I also wanted to show power differentials. I was very interested in looking at the whole kind of ladder of healthcare workers, who are all important, but it's not like they're all equally well paid or even equally well supplied with PPE these days. I mean, there was a time when I read about, say the cleaners weren't getting PPE, and that seemed such an interesting example of the awful kind of hierarchies. So I thought, well, I want to have a doctor, and my nurse midwife is at the center of it, but why don't I bring in a volunteer, Bridie, who has like no background, who's getting paid nothing, and yet she's really into this because it's meaningful work. And Bridie is the only character I've ever written who is based on a government report. Just like Canada, Ireland is going through a long period of kind of breastfeeding and analyzing its history for what we did to the people we locked up. And Ireland locked up really big percentages of its populations in a kind of welfare state, which they now call a sort of carceral or surveillance state. So these were residential institutions of various kinds, orphanages, so-called Magdalene hospitals for fallen girls, mother and baby homes where you had to stay on for either 1 year or two to kind of work off the costs of your birth there, reformatories, orphanages. It's just a horrifying kind of pipeline of pseudo welfare institutions that were so abusive. And in Canada, we rightly recognize many of these institutions as like specifically genocidal against Indigenous people. In Ireland, it was not an ethnic difference at all. It was just the poor. The poor would get, their kids taken away from them. And the poor would be told, oh, you're not able to bring up your child. We'll take the child to the nuns. And often these institutions were specifically aimed at punishing women, basically, for all the effects of being sexual human beings. So I guess with Bridie, the story got very political, really, because I decided I wanted her to be, a nobody, lowest of the low. And that meant she was from this system. And of course, any babies born, say, to unmarried mothers in this hospital in 1918, they're heading for that system too. And Bridie wants to, save one of them. So in a way, even though I was writing about a fairly good institution, this hospital that treats everybody for free and mostly treats the poor families of Dublin, in a way that raised the question of institutions and the charity or welfare system and all the bad aspects of it too. So in a way, the novel becomes a kind of a study of, all the ways in which people care for each other and how some of them are really just tyranny disguised as charity. So the Irish government, funded this huge analysis of our residential institutions called the Ryan Report, and I read it like cover to cover, and it was just so grim. And I didn't choose the grimmest parts of it at all. I actually tried to choose tiny little kind of vivid anecdotes. Like, I don't know, I remember one survivor of this sort of orphanage said that, a cook had been really nice to her, and giving her the scraps to bring out to the pig, the cook had put an entire boiled egg on top. And, this woman remembered this all her life as that amazing act of kindness. There she was rooting through the scraps and there was a whole boiled egg. So that's the kind of tiny detail I was talking about, that, there's just no substitute for doing really long and slow research, because you find these tiny stories that break your heart,
I mean, one of the Kathleen Lynn, she is actually based on a real person, yes, and
she's totally real, and I didn't mean her to be. I plan a lot about my novels. I'm a big planner, but of course, things go off the rails. In this case, I was not looking to include real people because I've written many novels about real people, but in this case, I had like the big pandemic, huge worldwide event, and I had to be, factual, not just truthy. You can't, with medical stuff, you can make it up. That seemed deeply disrespectful. So I had to get things right, like, which positions would help a baby get past the pubic bone. So I had to use so much fact. I thought, at least I'll use totally fictional characters. But when I was researching Irish doctors at the time and looking to see were any of them women, I find this woman who's this extraordinary, she was active in suffragette causes, in socialist causes, in, helping refugees. She lived with a woman all her life. And she was a doctor with a specialty in obstetrics, and she ran her own flu clinic. And she was also an Irish revolutionary. She was involved in our, violent uprising in 1916. She was sent to prison, and then she came back from prison, and she was on the run from police during the very weeks that my novel was set. So I could not shut the door to her. So I tried to keep her at bay a little bit. I tried to give her a fictional name and fictionalize some details about her, but by draft 2, she had like strode to the front of the novel and she was saying, "Call me Dr. Kathleen Lynn." So actually, I ended up writing about her in a very accurate way because she's so superb. I couldn't have made her up.
I love that too. A lot of readers think we sort of just imagine things and move things around at will, but so much of writing is this like loud talking in the middle of the night from somewhere you can't explain. And I love it when characters like push their way into a book, because
no, you're right. And fictional characters can do this just as much as factual ones. Yeah, I'm not saying like, oh, because she was real, I had to include her. No. Yeah. I once had 2 of my characters like fall in love, and I had not planned this. I had not authorized it, and they were like looking all moony at each other. So I was like, okay. Yes,
not authorized. It was an unauthorized relationship.
Your powers are limited.
It is. It really is. And I think
like.
it's probably the most stressful part about writing is that you actually don't have control as much as you think. And then you just have to answer to these people that are imagined. And that's what happens.
I'm not even sure we have that much control over what we write about. We form our obsessions, don't we? We're like the slightly mad-eyed person at the party saying, "Let me tell you about something I've discovered."
I don't have any control. So I'm really glad that you said that, because I have not been able to control what comes next. It's just sort of what happens. So it's good to hear that from you. We are going to open up the Q&A officially in a few 5 to 10 minutes, but I know some of you are already dropping your questions in there. If you have questions, drop some more, because I'm going to base how much time I leave. I have a question I want to close with. So I'm going to base how much time I leave by how many questions are in there. So don't wait until the question and answer period to drop your questions in there. If you have some, drop them now.
Can you all hear how well structured this interview is, by the way? This is a proper kind of masterclass in how you shape an interview.
Got to keep it rolling. I want to ask about the pandemic piece, because I'm really curious what it was like for you researching a pandemic, spending so much time in a pandemic, certainly not expecting a pandemic in present day, and then having to actually live through it. Like, was it helpful? Was it stressful to come out of working on the book to then be writing, to live it in your real life? Like, I can't even imagine.
Well, at first I felt embarrassed, like when I realized, I had just delivered a book and they'd already bought this book about 1918 pandemic, and then here was COVID. And I thought, oh, well, obviously nothing's getting published at the moment. We weren't even sure about, paper supply. My British publishers were like, we don't know, will we get enough paper? So I thought, oh, they'll put mine off, and then they were like, it was meant to be published in 2021, and suddenly they were saying, you know what, let's bring it out like now. I didn't know publishers could publish that fast. Usually they tell us that it takes years, don't they? They're like, oh, there's no space in the schedule till 2 years from now. So suddenly they were saying, let's bring it out in July because it's relevant. And I felt really embarrassed that anyone would think I was trying to make a buck off suffering, But my publishers were like, people are interested in this stuff right now. And I realized that then I could spend a lot of time talking about healthcare workers and the risks they take for us, and how much they sacrifice. And I could, really, not in some saccharine way, but I could truly celebrate and take seriously the lives of healthcare workers. So I thought, okay, I'll go with this, and I'll see it as not so much, here's my new book, Haven't I Wonderful, but more like, isn't it interesting what pandemics do to a society, how they're kind of, they're like an X-ray for injustice. And I did find it a bit unnerving, especially during the first year of COVID, to see how many things in the newspapers were echoing stuff I'd read from 1918. Like, for instance, the kind of propaganda posters. Like the US did all these rhyming ones about coughs and sneezes spread diseases. There's not so much rhyming with COVID. Maybe it needs to be more sophisticated.
Pandemic rhymes.
Yeah, you can imagine the kids' book. Yeah, but no, that's a silly example. But I remember there was a lot of propaganda posters that basically blamed the poor and the vulnerable for catching the illness. There was a lot about, make sure to live in a well-ventilated space. Well, yeah, that would be lovely if you could. Or I remember one sign that said, at the first symptom, lie down and have yourself nursed for 2 weeks. Again, sounds delightful if you're a duchess, and so when I heard, various politicians blaming people for their pre-existing conditions or their crowded lifestyles, or for being fat, basically, I thought, this is just like 1918. We have learned nothing. So, phrases that I didn't even have when I was researching the book, like the social determinants of health, they come up all the time now, and I can see so clearly how we hear a lot about, kindness and neighborliness and caremongering in Canada, but let's face it, there's been a lot of, ruthless, judgmental, competing for resources. I was kind of appalled that because Ontario's vaccine rollout was so, messy, frankly, there I was like, on Twitter, desperately trying to find out which pharmacies had them in this kind of ruthless, I must get vaccines for my family, I was kind of, shaken by that. So yeah, having written a novel about it beforehand, I don't know if it made me any wiser, but it certainly kind of made me quite attuned to these issues of selfishness and injustice, I guess.
I love what you said about it, pandemics offering sort of an X-ray of where we are as a society and where we are as a people. And
yeah,
I've definitely seen that.
Where we've spent the budget, because by the time some tower block is becoming a COVID hotbed, it's probably 30 years after the financial decisions that made it so,
Well, it was funny at the beginning, you mentioned that you were reading about the pandemic and then you thought about a dystopia. And I have to mention this, I don't think you'll mind. But I read Songs for the End of the World, I think is what it's called, by Salima Nawaz, which is a pandemic dystopia, right? And so the two of your books actually came out at the same time and provide a really interesting look at pandemics and how, both from a future perspective and a past perspective, it's really quite fascinating. And I thought it was so fascinating to me that both of you read about the pandemics of the past and then wrote these different novels that approach the subject differently. I love it. And that they came out at the same time feels like.
Yeah, I think, novels set in the future or sci-fi and historical fiction have a lot in common. In a way, obviously, they're all rooted in the moment when you're writing. Of course, you're going to bring your questions, your interest, your priorities to it. That doesn't worry me. I don't think that's anachronistic. That just means you're alive right now and writing it. But in each case, it's as if some of us feel freer to tell the stories that are clearly relevant to now, but setting them in a different time, you can just see them from a different angle. So that kind of, as it were, time travel, whether you go forward or back, it's still a kind of a stepping away from now in order to comment all the more vividly on the stuff that matters now.
Love that. Sometimes I do these interviews and I'm like, I'm going to be thinking about that a lot afterwards. I'm going to go to bed and be thinking about the commonalities between historical fiction and sci-fi, especially because I've written sci-fi, but I'm afraid of historical fiction. I'm just like, so I wanted to ask about grief, because I think what's fascinating about a maternity ward, in addition to the fact that it's a place where life begins, it's also the place in all cases, but in this novel in particular, where lives end as well. And I wondered if this was a subject matter you intentionally wanted to navigate, or you were sort of forced, if it's a maternity ward and these things happen, I have to sort of unpack this idea of grief and loss. So perhaps a little nosy, feel free to just be like, no, I don't want to answer that. But yeah, what role did grief play? What did you learn about it as you wrote?
And it's funny, you know, I've written quite a lot about grief and I've experienced almost none, you know, and my parents are dead now, but they died at 89 and 92. You know, we can't complain. I've had really no terrible grief in my life. It's just, as a subject for literature, irresistible to me, because, you know, you really see what's going on for someone if you rent away something they love. So yeah, I might say I didn't set out to write a novel about grief, but of course I picked a pandemic and I picked a maternity ward, you know. You know, one really important thing happened to me when we've got two kids, they're 17 and 14 now. And when the 17-year-old, when I was giving birth to him, you know, one little thing went wrong. You know, you sit down with any group of women who've given birth and you'll find like little things went wrong, which you realize in a different situation without good health care could have killed them. So it's quite common to be like, oh, you could have died, you could have died, you could have died. And so, you know, one thing went wrong with me, and the midwives called in the gynecologist, and she ran in and literally saved me with her bare hands. And I barely even like noticed it went by so fast. And afterwards I thought, oh, that's the moment. I mean, of course, there are many moments when our lives diverge from those of, say, previous centuries. But I thought, oh, that's the specific moment where if I was in the 18th century, I'd have died right there. But I didn't. So all this is like extra time. It's like injury time at the end of a soccer game. Oh, look, I'm using a sports
You did
metaphor.
A sports reference. I told her I wouldn't ask you sports.
Soccer would probably be the only one where I'd be able to make even that much of a sports reference. And I did once write a soccer story in which they picked up the ball and ran. My partner's still embarrassed that I read that aloud in public, you know. So anyway, I shouldn't try and bring in sports metaphors. But yeah, I felt like, whoa, that's the moment I would have died. And if I was in, you know, there are parts of the world where you might be like 2 days walk away from a clinic. And so that's where I would have died too. So I felt my luck. I felt my extraordinary luck. So I put that entire medical incident straight into the book. I gave it to one of the patients, but I have the midwife save her, as it were, and I show the whole thing from the midwife's point of view. And it was fascinating to take a thing that happened to me and replay it, but from the position of the healthcare worker who saved me. So yeah, I take this really seriously. So, you know, childbirth is a perilous business. The wonderful actress who did the audiobook of Room, she played the boy, and she died in childbirth a few years later. So, you know, I hate when people either don't write about childbirth at all, thinking it's a big taboo, or if they write about it in some kind of saccharine way. I mean, it's both a thrilling and natural thing and totally dangerous thing, you know. And people like people like Beyonce have been really frank about, you know, for instance, the special childbirth hazards that Black women face in America. So childbirth is a really political matter, and it's a really crucial matter in women's history. So I guess committing to write a novel set in a maternity ward was necessarily going to foreground, you know, the risks and the losses. And it's funny, ever since writing Room, I've been really aware that the novelist is in some sense the captor, the evil captor of her characters. I mean, you could say that we, you know, give them life in the first place, but then we sure limit their options, don't we? And we make bad things happen to them just to make better drama. So, you know, with The Pull of the Stars, I was aware I was doling out life and death. I was sitting there looking at my kind of list of characters and going, well, not all the babies are going to live.
Die,
you know?
live.
Yeah. I was like, it's a pandemic. I need to be honest here. I can't have happy endings for all of you. You know, like with Grey's Anatomy, right? Somebody's going to die in just about every episode.
Every season finale, you're going to come back and there's one character or more short.
Yeah. So yeah, I knew in a way there had to be, you know, losses to balance the blissful moments, and that the blissful moments, you know, would be all the more sweet when there's this context of death and losses. And if Julia is literally carrying around a watch marked with little symbols that represent all the patients she's lost, she's going to fight so hard for every woman there. You know, one of the things she does is she's got a sharp sense of smell, and she's always leaning into them and smelling for any hint of childbed fever, which was so likely to kill so many women back then. And, you know, many doctors and nurses introduced it to the women by touching them without scrubbing their hands enough. So Julia does a lot of hand washing and a lot of watching out for like the very first possible hints of something which is going to snatch this woman away from her life and from her baby. So yeah, it's, you know, it's a dark novel. I often feel quite bad for putting my readers through sorrow, but I guess I want to make them feel, you know.
I always feel terrible, and then I'm like, sorry. Okay, so we have a ton of questions, and I didn't leave as much time as I promised I would. So sorry, guys.
Answer them fast.
So we'll go through as many as I can. I want to ask this first one about the cover, because I love cover questions. And I'm so glad somebody else loves it enough to pose it. So there's a question about the magpie on the cover of the book and the art. How did you feel about this cover? Because I imagine it was the first one, and then you sort of probably got international covers that came in afterwards.
It's more my British and Canadian and American presses. They're usually simultaneous these days. That's one thing that's changed while I've been publishing, is that it used to be like you'd publish your book in, say, Britain, and then maybe a year later with all the British reviews it would come out in America. But you know, the internet has made us all more synchronized. So they often share covers or swap covers, but in this case, the Americans did a cover based on Julia's watch with lots of stars and moons, and the British suddenly fixated on the magpie, which, you know, Julia's brother Tim, who she lives with, you know, is mute from war trauma, and he has a pet magpie. I wanted to suggest that he has a nurturing capacity in him, and so they took this tiny detail. Suddenly we have a magpie going through the sky, and I love it. Actually, it's not obvious at all, but I just thought it was rather extraordinary. And you know, it's funny, like the title says a pull of the stars, so you're thinking stars in the sky, but actually what you see is a sky with these two birds, and there's one for sorrow, two for joy, is the rhyme about magpie. So it's a very suggestive bird, and somehow that cover just works. It wouldn't be something you'd come up with in a logical meeting, but it is a flash of real creativity, you know. And then say, you know, here's the paperback from Little Brown. You've got a much more paperback cover. I mean, they often go for a slightly, you know, likable, soft focus cover a year later for the paperback, like, oh, look, nice nurse in her nice costume. So the hardback covers do tend to be a bit more, you know, taking a leap or a risk, you know.
I love that. Okay, so I've been looking through, there's so many, I'm like, oh. One of the questions was about process. I feel it's really good for the writers who have tuned in to ask a little bit about the process and how you work through your process in writing. Do you sketch? Do you outline? We know that you dive deep into the research. So like, do you stop and then move into writing, or is it something that happens all the way through?
I do a lot of research at the start to help me come up with the bones of the story. But then, of course, every time I write a sentence, there'll be something I need to check. I mean, with historical fiction, you cannot get through a sentence without having to stop. Luckily, the internet allows you to just stop briefly and check. It used to be you had to go off to the library or go off to the archive in the small town. So there's ongoing research, but there's certainly a big block at the start, like many months, where I'd be going like, I'd have read lots of books about the flu of 1918 and sometimes about other pandemics and about nurses and midwives and nurse training. You know, that the tendrils of research go off in many directions. And not just books. I'd have been looking at websites about all those things midwives do that are not written down. You know, when I was giving birth, I found, you know, the doula taught my partner to press behind my hips, and it made all the difference. And I couldn't find that in any kind of official training manuals. I thought maybe this is just the kind of, you know, stuff women have taught each other over the centuries. So yeah, you research in all directions. And then I do a lot of planning and outlining and sitting there thinking, okay, like, could I manage without a fourth day? Could I manage with just 3 days? And, you know, when should the different disasters and crises and some good things happen to the different patients? So sometimes it felt like trying to stay in charge of this busy ward. And I felt like a bit of a slapdash nurse because, you know, I'd think everyone was doing fine. And then I'd realize that, you know, Julia hadn't given any of them a bedpan or a meal in about 12 hours, you know. So I actually had a little list of duties for her. And I was like, whoa, hasn't done that. Oh, must give that one a, you know, a poultice, all these incredibly time-consuming duties. In fact, that's why the Bridie is in there at all, because I saw it very much as Julia's novel, but I was working out like how she would change a patient's sheets. I was looking at the diagrams where you roll them and fold the sheet, and I realized there's no way you can do this without another pair of hands. So in a way, Bridie came into the novel because of the practicalities of nursing, which I discovered by doing this research. And if I just stayed like broad strokes about the nursing, I wouldn't have known that you needed another pair of hands. So the research is actually really fruitful for story.
Mm.
So yeah, lots of planning, but then, when things change, you let them change, because it's not like architecture, right? The building's not going to fall down if you suddenly change the position of a pillar,
I love it. I would love to like see your notes and like the scratches and the circles. This is like the nerd in me is like wants to get inside your notebooks and be like, what does it look like in Emma's, not just her head, but in her
Well, for one thing,
world?
it's not paper notebooks. I use a program for
computer.
Apple Mac called Scrivener, which allows you to kind of assemble lots of little bits. And then if you want to suddenly put them all in a different order, and you can have a little research file within each one, so it's a kind of a Lego type of program, lots of little chunks and then move them around. So stuff like that can really help.
Amazing. I just started using Scrivener like for this last book. So I'm like, now even more, just send me your Scrivener notes. There's a question here. We've been talking about you being in Ireland right now, working on Wonder. We know Room got turned into a film. So we're just wondering if this book has been optioned for a film yet, if there's hopes, plans.
This is a funny thing. I don't option my books because I want to keep all the rights unless the movie's definitely going to happen with really good people. So what I've done, and I have other film projects that haven't come to fruition. It's not like all my books turn into films successfully. But with the two that I have done, in each case, I've done a really unusual, what they call an attachment deal, where I just kind of pinky promise with the producers, we're going to make this movie together, but nobody pays anybody until it's time for the film to be actually made. So this way I keep all the power over my work until I'm absolutely sure it's going to happen. Because yourself, there's so many examples of writers selling their book and then either it never gets made or they are deeply embarrassed by what happens, and they're like, oh, I renounce it.
Change the title.
To answer your question, yeah, I haven't sold The Pull of the Stars, but I'm working on a screenplay. Like you see these little orange bits, that's me marking up bits I might want to find a way of retelling in the screenplay. So yeah, I'm attempting to adapt it, and I love the process of adaptation. I find it really, really interesting to take a novel and say to yourself, well, it's not a novel anymore, it's going to be a film, totally different thing. And that's a shorter thing. Like you can't include as many moments, you can't include as many words. Your scenes will be so vivid because they're visual or through sound, but there won't be as many of them. So you have to really pick which ones to include. And I find that a really interesting challenge. It's a further limitation.
You really like limitations. You like people to make things like, even you're like, maybe I should go from 4 days to 3. Most people are like, can I do 5? Can I do 6? You're trying to shrink it all the time.
I mean, for instance, right, if you said, oh, The Pull of the Stars, that could be the basis for a kind of a Call the Midwife set in 1918. So give us 20 episodes. I would be appalled at the idea of trying to spin out the complications of 20 episodes. But a feature film, I'm like, oh yes, I see how I could
tighten it down, squeeze it harder. Love that. Okay, so I have one last question from myself that I saved, and it's more because we're here with the Gillers. They're probably just going to pull us off the stage in a few minutes. But we're going into a new Giller season. It's the last of the 14 episodes from the long list. You've written a lot of books. You've won awards for some didn't. So I'm curious if you have advice for readers, but especially for writers going into award season.
Yeah, like these prizes are meant to help us, right? They're fairy dust, right? So if you happen to get longlisted for something, you're getting like a sprinkle of fairy dust, and that lasts all the way until a few of you get the teaspoonful of fairy dust, which means you've been shortlisted. But even then, look, I'm on this book club because I got longlisted for the Giller. That is just a good thing in itself. And then the one person who wins the Giller gets the like big cup full of fairy dust, but it's all fairy dust. So if you at any point are sitting pouting by the phone going, oh, why was I snubbed? Then you've basically, you've turned the whole fairy dust exercise into bitter poison. So I've been shortlisted for so many awards, like way more than I've ever won. And in each case, I've really tried to say to myself, great, I got shortlisted. People will hear of the book who wouldn't otherwise. That is what these book prizes are for. They're not perfect by any means, but they're great at countering the decisions of the market. They're great at saying like, this obscure book here is so good, read it. So I really try not to obsess over winning. And I always say to myself, if it's the kind of event where you don't know who's won until the last minute. I sit there saying to myself, it's like a 1 in 6 roll of the dice. Odds are you won't win, but it's a great gala anyway. So basically, don't let yourself get bitter and twisted about it.
It's great advice for anything, frankly. Don't let yourself get bitter and twisted out about anything, but
No, you're right.
especially as we enter award season. And I know the readers are all looking forward to next year's list, but it was such an honor to be here tonight, to talk to you, to ask you questions. I feel like I could do a whole other interview about adaptations and film, and I will one day. I'm going to make it happen.
And I could interview you
fun.
one day. That would be lovely to do a reciprocal.
Sure.
Somebody make that happen.
Make that happen. But yeah, thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to the film that you're working on. I'm wanting to let you go so that you can go to sleep, because I feel like it is super late now when we've got you all wound
though.
up.
I may lie awake with my brain wired thinking of further responses to your questions. This has been an overstimulating interview. I'll never sleep now.
I go out and I'm like so hungry after these conversations. I think we might have time. I'm going to see if I can peek at one more time. Oh, this is a really good one because we're getting to the end. So this one is about the pace of the novel and whether when you were writing this, you had the pace in mind, whether you wanted it to move a little bit slower and then sort of pick up at the end, if there was sort of an intentional slowing down and picking up that you put into it in the planning process?
Yeah, I thought of it a lot as the rhythms of nursing. For instance, like I know that short chapters are easier for readers. Readers are so busy, and if they can get a little chapter read, that feels great. But unfortunately, with this novel, I really wanted to make you feel like a nurse. So I wanted those long shifts, which would have ups and downs and dramatic moments and slow moments all within one long chapter. So that means very few chapters. I say this because I can't remember exactly how many. four chapters only. And within that, yeah, I tried to make it like, I didn't want the action to be too neatly spaced out, because I thought, in reality, how it's going to go is that suddenly, 2 women will start giving birth simultaneously and then nobody the next day. So I tried to make it a very realistic, messy rhythm. And of course, I tried to give readers little kind of respites. So there's a big respite when Julia and Bridie get to actually go up on the roof and have like all night chat. But equally within the busier sections, I wanted to make little moments where they have a cup of, bad 1918 tea and get to chat a little bit about their childhoods, and the women in the ward get to chat too. I tried to make it like childbirth, which is very unpredictable that way. I mean, not only some women give birth in 10 minutes and some give birth in 4 days, but equally, even within it, you can have like long, boring bit and then terrible sore bit and then happy bit, so it's really, childbirth is so interestingly odd. And I mean, what other thing is there that's, wonderful and joyful and natural and also potentially murderous, it's a dramatic gold mine. I don't know why people don't write about childbirth all the time. So yeah, some of the odd rhythms of The Poet of the Stars are because it's about birth.
Okay, I have one question before they come take us away, because I forgot to ask it in it. So when I listened to the audiobook, I didn't notice it as much, but when I opened the book, I noticed the sections are labeled as colors. And I wanted to ask you what research led to that, because I know it must be intentional.
Well, I mean, of course, the flu, just like COVID, frankly, could be a lot of different symptoms, and some people had it really mildly and some had it terribly. But of those who had it really badly, cyanosis produced this kind of, facial coloration thing, and especially among like pale Irish people, doctors would have looked out for this kind of, if she starts getting a little bit red in the cheeks, that's a sign, and if it's a little bit lavender colored tips of the nose or the lips, that's a bad sign. So I realized that was a lovely concrete example of how you would spot the danger of the flu rising up in your patient. I didn't want it to be like stats, the BP numbers. I never remember what BP numbers are normal anyway. So I suppose a novelist is always looking for really vivid and ideally sensory ways of telling a story rather than sort of statistics, which you might do if you were being more analytical. So yeah, as soon as I came across cyanosis, I was like, oh, I like the idea of a color warning system. And you'd think at first it's just kind of random, and then you realize we're kind of heading towards death, So yeah, it's funny, when I do research for these things, I'm nearly always looking out for like you know, the weird little vivid detail rather than the big broad point. You know, it's a kind of funny way of doing research that you're looking for, you know, tiny shell on the beach.
Which is just another reason why we all need access to your Scrivener notes, because we all need to like see how this magic came about, where you got what. I mean, I think it's just, it probably feels to you pretty straightforward. I did this and then I did this, but honestly, reading it, there's such a, and then talking to you about it now, there's such an epic, like I'm thinking about the pace, like labor, and the way that labor like culminates in this like really intensive moment. And Sarah's question about pace, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's beautiful. So thank you.
You're very kind.
Okay, I've
These
officially
questions have
run
been
it.
good, eh? These are some Giller quality questions. This is not just any crowd.
I've been well trained. It's been years.
Thank you so much, Jael and Emma. This was an amazing hour. What a wonderful blow up, fantastic way to end our book club this year. Thank you all for joining us this evening and for the past several months. The book club, we're now going to take a hiatus while we concentrate on the 2021 season. We're going to have our shortlist on September 8th, our long list on September 8th, our shortlist on October 5th, and please tune in to our gala, which will be a broadcast on November 8th at 9 p.m. Eastern Time by CBC. And then we will start our 2021 Giller Book Club in January 2022, again focusing on this year's long list. The full list will be available on our website by the end of December, and please don't forget to register. Thank you so much.